talking to my grandson, and he was wanting to learn how to use a Shopsmith. And I pointed out to him that, there's really two things we have to learn. First thing is you have to learn the machine and how to set it up. But the second thing is you have to learn each of the individual tools that the machine can be. As a table saw, you as a user have to behave completely different than when you set it up as a drill press. So it's a very versatile machine that can do a lot of things, but you got to learn how to use each of those functions. Well, one of those functions that woodworkers have asked of this machine for years is shaping / routing / molding. Now, those are three different things using three different tools. And what I mean by that is, the tooling itself that actually does the cutting. And all three of those can be done to some degree on the Shopsmith Mark V. Now, when I say Mark V, you might have a Mark VII, you might have a Mark II, whatever. I call it a Mark V because that's the tool that I own. Now, modern woodworkers are probably familiar with routers and router bits. This is a router bit. This one has a 1/2-inch diameter shank. Here in America, 1/4-inch and 1/2-inch shanks are quite common. Other parts of the world use metric diameters. In this case, I have two cutting edges, or two flutes, if you will. These are carbide tipped cutters here. For comparison, there's a 1/4-inch shank bit. There's a 1/2-inch shank bit. The advantage of the 1/2-inch shank is you've got more material holding the stock, keeping it running true. The advantage of a 1/4-inch shank is they're less expensive. And there are some places that we can take this bit that we can't take a 1/2-inch diameter bit, and that is we can, with some of these, pass them through a guide bushing in the base of a handheld router to do a number of routing operations, such as mortising for hinges on the edges of doors, cutting dovetails, and such. Here's a ridiculously huge, this is the biggest router bit I've ever used. I've used shaper cutters that were larger than this, but spinning in a router with a 1/2-inch chuck, this was pretty scary. Now, this is an unusual router bit. It is a router bit which you typically see that have two carbide cutting edges, but this one has four. It's a particularly smooth cutting bit. This one's just producing a 1/4-inch roundover, yet it's a relatively large diameter for that purpose. Very large diameter ball bearing on the top. And you'll also notice that the angle of this carbide tooth is what's called a negative rake. It's sending the chips into the cut, where the positive rake on this router or this edge is going to be pulling the chips out of the cut. It's a fascinating cutter. We won't get into it any deeper than that today. This is the largest cutter that I've actually used on this channel. And when I used this, I used it in a router table with a fixed router mounted, or a fixed base mounted to that router table. This is something that would just be absolutely crazy to spin on your Shopsmith. I wouldn't recommend it. So I guess it's a great point to talk about the two extremes of the Shopsmith users. We've got Shopsmith users that will insist on doing every single operation they possibly can with this one piece of equipment. And then you have others, and I would find myself in this camp, that will use this as much as I can, but I have no problem moving off of this platform and using a track saw for cutting large sheets instead of pushing those large sheets through this saw by myself, or using a router mounted in a router table for cutting some things where otherwise I know the Shopsmith just doesn't give me the speed that I need. And let's talk about speed, and this is why it matters. This router bit was intended to be spun about 22 to 23,000 RPMs to give us the optimal results. This machine behind me has a top speed of 5,200 RPM. 22 to 23,000, 5,200. Okay, well, what if I had a Power Pro headstock? The headstock with the electronic variable speed, that would get me up to 10,000 RPM. 22, 23,000, 10,000. Even there, I'm less than half of the recommended maximum RPM for this cutter. Now, shaper cutters are a different animal. Shaper cutters typically have three wings, three cutting edges on them. They're also a larger diameter because instead of having a shank or shaft coming out of them, they have a hole that passes through them. That hole is typically, for most do-it-yourselfers, going to be a 1/2 inch diameter hole. I've purchased shaper cutters from Grizzly, and they have them in a broad range of bores, but there you see a 1/2 inch bore. Now I'm taking that 5/8 inch shaft off of the quill. I'm reducing it down to 1/2 inch, and then that's going inside of the cutter as opposed to that cutter having the shaft on the end. This was kind of the state of the art back in the 1950s and 60s, but router bits got better and better over the years, and the cost of carbide has come down substantially. So now it's getting to where I can buy a carbide tipped router bit to perform this function for, in some cases, less than the cost of a steel shaper cutter, and most definitely a fraction of the cost of a carbide tipped shaper cutter. So that brings us to this video, which is kind of a weird one. I've already talked to a few of the folks over at mygrowthrings.com about this, that I feel like I'm short-circuiting the conversation because I'm kind of moving to the end. We're going to circle back and talk about standard routing with your Mark V. We'll talk about shaping with the Mark V. But today I want to talk about something that landed in the 1990s and the early 2000s that allowed this machine, without upgrading the motor itself, to be used for shaping and routing quite a bit closer to the correct speed for those cutters. And if you're not ahead of me, we're talking about the Shopsmith Speed Increaser, an interesting animal that I happen to have two of in the shop today. I just purchased one on eBay, and one of my viewers sent one in that we're going to tear apart and see how it works. So in this video, we're going to talk about the Speed Increaser, determine for you whether this is something you should have in your arsenal, and is it a good alternative to other approaches to shaping and routing. We'll find out. Well, it looks like it's going to have to spend a little bit of time in the evaporust. It is missing something that we would need to use this with a router bit, but it does have the shaper arbor installed. So let's take this off, and we'll see how this thing is used. And hopefully it's in good condition. Oh wow, yeah, there is a fair amount of rust in here. So you can see here that it has a 1/2 inch hole, and that can either receive this 1/2 inch shaper arbor. So it's got the threaded portion that you would typically find on a shaper that has a 1/2 inch thread, and then the shank of this is a 1/2 inch, yet it's been reduced down so that when we capture this with a set screw on either side, we're not creating burrs on that shaft that would make it impossible to remove. So that's by design. Now what's missing here is a 1/2 inch to 1/4 inch router collet. It's a unique collet. If I took the collet out of my Ryobi, or I just bought a brand new one from Harbor Freight, and put it in here, it would be damaged and it wouldn't hold the bit properly, because the collet for this one has just a single split that's cutting that collet almost in half, and then the same set screws that push in from opposite sides would close that collet around the 1/4 inch router bit. It's a design that works fine, and for this tool, it's what was necessary because of the way that we are capturing the collet with the two set screws. I'm going to put this in just in case I accidentally turn this on when it's mounted on the machine. Make sure this is held in place. It's cast iron, so it's becoming heavier by the moment. You can see here that it is made to go on to the end of the quill, and it's driven by a drive hub that you put on the end of the quill. So let's see, that is a 5-spline drive hub, and I always forget, and yeah, this one's a 4-spline. So it's got to be the drive hub from a 5/8 inch shaft. That would mean something like my bandsaw or my belt sander I could steal this hub from. And I'm going to put that right here on my quill and lock it down on that tapered flat. Now I'm just going to put it on here temporarily. We'll move it to its proper position in a few minutes. There's also a clamp that gets installed. You may recall this clamp is the same clamp that's used on the speed reducer. It's used on the lathe duplicator, and it's also used on the Pro planer. And this bracket right here is used on the speed reducer as well. And that allows us to set that on the weigh tubes, slide this over the quill, rotating that until our splines align, and then we should be able to press that on. All right, so the rest of this adjustment needs to be done, the alignment of this needs to be done with it underneath the table. So that takes us to one other discussion, and that is we're going to be replacing the saw insert or whatever insert happens to be in there with either the drum sander insert or the shaper insert. You'll notice the shaper insert has a smaller diameter hole. Now this one happens to have a chuck built, or a chuck. This happens to have a dust chute on the bottom. So because we're going to be coming up through the bottom of the table like this, I need to take that dust chute off of here. That should also hint to you that we have a bit less dust collection capability with this setup as we do with the drill press overhead. Working over this, we can have a dust collector connected to it, not from under the table. So let's get some things cleared off here and get to that. All right, for this, I'm going to be working off of the end of the table, so I'm going to go ahead and slide my carriage down to the end, and we'll lock that in place. There we go. And then I'm gonna let me get this spacer to the other side. We'll get more or less centered on the hole. The headstock is locked, and we'll lower the carriage down here. I do need to take the shaper cutter out and mount a router bit or a drill bit in there. Let me do that. All right, so let's hold this here, and it's kind of hard to see by the flutes of that bit, but we are touching at the top, but not at the bottom. So that means I need to raise this casting up a little bit in relation to the base, right about there. This is a one-time setup, thank goodness. Okay, looks pretty good. And viewed from the side, okay. Side, again, we're touching at the top but not at the bottom, so this needs to be rotated this direction. Now to rotate, I'm going to have to loosen it on the quill because currently I have it tightened to the quill. And with that loose, I can give it a little bit of a turn. And didn't let me go far enough, so I've got to loosen the bolt over on this side to allow me to have the amount of play I need to come this way. Well, actually, I might need to loosen the other one just a tad. Now, if that's properly installed, we should be able to remove this and reinstall it and have it still be in proper alignment. Let me try that. I'm going to loosen the clamp, slide the headstock over, release it from the quill. Okay, fully removed. Put it back on here. Tighten it on the quill. Slide it back under the table. Ooh, gotta not put that bit through my eye. That would be a bad prize. All right, pull this down. And we also want to make sure while we're at it here that we're doing our 5-point safety check, that our table is not going to suddenly become tilted on us. Carriage is not going to drop. Headstock is locked. Whoa, headstock was loose for a moment there. You know, if that headstock had been loose during that initial setup, we would be in a world of problems here. And to me, that looks okay. I would want to tweak this some more if what I was routing here was with a long straight bit, because any little error might begin to show up. But I think what I want to demonstrate here is with a decorative bit. So we'll throw a decorative bit in here and do just a little bit of freehand routing. Before I lock everything down, I'll bring that table down, and that'll help me get this centered inside of that insert. Lock the clamp down. And let's check this thing out. Let's try starting it up at slow speed and see what we see. And then we'll crank it up to the normal speed for shaping, which is 5,200 RPM. We're starting on slow. All right, so far seems to be okay. Let's try a little freehand routing here against that ball bearing. All right, so let's just do this. We'll take it on at the full speed. I could do this in a couple passes if I was concerned that I was taking off too much in a single pass. Let's try this in a single pass and see what happens. It is just a piece of pine. It might do okay. Wow, I completely forgot which way a shaper cutter cuts or router bit cuts. I was feeding that direction. I need to be feeding that direction against the rotation of that bit. So forgive me for doing that wrong. Goodness. So a little bit chippy. Interestingly, I got a better cut when I was climb feeding, going the wrong direction. And keep in mind, we're still going less than half the recommended high speed or top speed for this bit. Let's try this on the other edge, and let's do this in 2 passes. We got all the time in the world here. Let's just do that. All right, that's definitely a cleaner cut and a smoother approach to this. Now you might ask yourself, okay, how would it behave on end grain? Less than ideal. let's try that again. Again, I'm gonna raise it up. Now, ideally, what I would do is have a stop collar set for my final depth, but I don't have that. Okay, and there you go. Yeah, you can see we have a bit of tear out on that end grain. That's not going to look pretty. Definitely would end up having to use some filler on that. I still have that chunk of cherry floating around here that we were playing with. It does not have a good edge on it, but we can go across this piece of end grain and let's see how it behaves. Well, hey, we'll do this and then this. Go back up a bit, make our first pass, and then we'll come in and do our final pass. I forget how my earbuds affect what you hear. Let's make another pass at that with the earbuds out. And this should be then using just the audio from the phone. Got nicer cut than we have on the end grain. But not a rough ride by any means. Raise that back up a bit. I took a different path that time. Again, you get the idea. It's not bad. It's not bad. Is it as good as a router? No. Is it as good as a shaper? Well, actually, that's as good as I was typically getting with a shaper at 5,200 RPM. And the fact that these are carbide tip knives, I can route and route and route and route and route all day, all weekend long, and they're going to last. Well, they'll last. So I think it's a pretty cool tool. It definitely is a missing link between the standard Mark V that can go to 5,200 RPM, 5,300 RPM, and the Power Pro with the electronic variable speed that can go up to 10,000 RPMs. With this, I can take my standard Mark V and I can take it up to 10,000 RPM, and allows me to do shaping and routing. Now you saw, is it amazing routing? Nah, it's okay routing. And this leads me to the conclusion that I would say that we'll talk about for the next several videos, and that is there's good reason why Shopsmith themselves got into some machines that used handheld routers. They had the Joint-Matic, which held a router in the horizontal position and allowed you to make joinery, make mortise and tenons and things. They also had the overhead pin router, which allowed you to route from overhead, following a template or just using the bearing, and the routing system that included the overhead router along with under table routing. And then over the years since, they've even added on router tables that could be put onto the platform of your Mark V. So having a handheld router and using it with router tables or freehand is not in any way disparaging your Shopsmith Mark V. In upcoming videos, we'll talk about using this machine for routing and shaping without a speed increaser as well as with, and we'll see some more examples of that. I look forward to your questions, comments, and cheap shots, and in the meantime, make it a great week.